Christopher Gaddis. Am I pronouncing your last name?
Close.
Say it correctly.
Gaddis.
Gaddis, as someone whose name is always mispronounced. Gaddis. Christopher Gaddis is Chief Human Resources Officer for JBS, which is an international company that is based in Brazil, owns Pierce Chicken, Black Angus Beef, if you've ever had those brands at the grocery store. And their most recent acquisition was a Brazilian company, which is the chief sponsor of the World Cup. So Chris lucks out.
I guess
I don't have tickets. I could tell.
But in 2006 and 2007, his company and some of the factories and meat packing plants were among those that were rated by DHS. And so the company sort of had to step back and regroup and figure out what they were going to do to move forward. And so he is here both to speak a little bit about that, but really to look forward at some of the practices that they are doing now. And without further ado, Chris, and he's opted to stand.
Yeah, I'll stand. Sitting down, I think you expect big things from people that sit when they talk. As was said, I'm Chief Human Resources Officer for JBS. What that means is I'm the HR guy. Today, JBS is a really interesting company, again, based out of Brazil. About 140,000 employees worldwide, 85,000 in the U.S., over 40 processing facilities, meat packing facilities here in the United States. And it's a fascinating workforce. Just a quick example of that. We entered the U.S. market in July of 2007 by acquiring a company called Swift & Company. Anybody heard of Swift? a lot of groans and oh yes. We acquired Swift & Company in July of 2007. Now many of you know of Swift & Company because in December of 2006, it was the site of the largest worksite enforcement action in the history of DHS and ICE. But I'd like to tell you a little about Swift and take you back before that 5 years. In the middle of 2002, Swift was cited by the Office of Special Counsel for acting too aggressively in the verification of the work eligibility of its employees. So we're in 2002, we got cited $2.5 million for acting too aggressively in the verification of the work eligibility of our workforce. Fast forward 4 years, and wham. Different arm of the Department of Justice, this time ICE, the largest worksite enforcement action in history. To me, I think that epitomizes the experience of a lot of employers in our industry and other manufacturing industries in trying to walk this very delicate line between non-discrimination and worker verification. I'm getting some nods. I think some people are hungry for lunch. Let me take this story a little further. And in December 2009, we acquired a company out of Pittsburgh, Texas, the other Pittsburgh, called Pilgrim's Pride Corporation. Who's heard of Pilgrim's Pride? Those of you from Texas and the South will know it's one of the largest chicken companies in the world. Today it's second behind Tyson. In March through, let's call it November of 2008, Pilgrim's Pride was the site of, guess what? The second largest worksite enforcement action in the history of ICE. And it was actually a series of 3 or 4. I don't think it's I don't think it's just a fluke that these are in our industry, the meat packing, meat processing industry. But I'd venture to guess there are other people standing in other rooms, maybe in not quite as important a place as this, telling the same story. I get the opportunity because I have a job where I'm over people to talk about people and places. Let me tell you a little bit about our flagship Greeley, Colorado plant. Over 3,000, depending upon the day, about 3,200 employees. And there are 27 languages spoken there. So I once heard somebody say it's like the United Nations, only if they gave everyone knives when they walked in. and to me, while that's in jest, that's actually very accurate. And it's a testament to our workforce and the quality of our workforce that we don't have issues. Certainly we have the occasional safety issue, but we never have issues like you might think when you have people of such different backgrounds in a facility together at the same time. So 27 languages, and it presents a lot of issues. A lot of issues. Starting in July of 2007, at that plant, again, this plant that suffered through the raids, we came in and we said, hey, we're going to start a second shift at this plant. A second shift. That means first shift goes sometime from between 5:30 and 6 a.m. until 3 p.m. Then you have a second shift that comes in after the cleanup crew for another 8-hour shift, and then you have the night cleanup crew. So we decided we're going to actually start a second shift, which meant, all right, we're going to go out, we're going to hire. Right? We've got to hire a lot of people. We usually hire about 400 people a week. Today, that's about what we hire a week, about 400 people across the country. And we jacked that up to about 1,000 a week. Now, our industry, as you might imagine, it's a tough industry, a lot of turnover. So our blended turnover rate between beef, pork, and chicken sits in the sort of mid-30s. So we're hiring almost 2.5 times our regular hire rate to try to bring a second shift up to speed in Greeley. And in order to do that, Greeley's a relatively small town in northern Colorado, an hour north of Denver, maybe 100,000 people. The University of Northern Colorado sits there, and it's got about 25,000 of those 100,000 students. So there just weren't enough people. And so what did we do? Well, we looked at Fort Morgan, Colorado, which has a Cargill plant, and we talked to them, and they said, hey, we're utilizing, for the first time in our history, we're utilizing refugee labor, and you should do that. So remember, we have 27 languages being spoken in the plant. We automatically introduced 10 new languages utilizing refugee labor. And that, as you can imagine, created other issues. Drains on social services, issues with cultural relations, explaining to people from different countries where the police were the worst people in the world, that when police turn their sirens on, you don't run like hell. A true story. And that's part of the schools, school resources were very impacted. Of course, hospitals are deeply affected. And so, not just from a policy perspective, but from a cultural perspective, we're kind of a petri dish of what can happen here with an immigration reform bill. All right, so now let's talk about the bill. I'm not smart enough to figure out how to do it, but I know what won't work. Okay. E-Verify is not a tool to prevent identity theft. Is anybody surprised by that? Is anybody? Because it seems like people think that there's a correlation between E-Verify and identity theft. If you gave me $750 right now, I could have a job for you. I could have an identification for you that could get by E-Verify in 20 minutes. It may take me longer out here. I don't have as many contacts. But I could do that for you. So from an employer's perspective, again, keeping the smart people out of it for just a minute, from an employer's perspective, you've got to address identity theft. And E-Verify doesn't do that. Okay, the other piece of that is thinking about the SWIFT raids. Okay, the Senate bill currently says, hey, use E-Verify, but if there's identity theft, the good faith presumption that you complied with E-Verify goes away. Okay, so think about that. You have a crappy tool. We want you to use the crappy tool. And if the crappy tool doesn't do what everybody knows it won't do, you're screwed. That's my first issue with the Senate bill. All right. My second issue with the Senate bill, and it's obviously a little more muted than my first, is pretty simple. And it is, I thought you were going to show me a card. Okay. All right. My second issue with the Senate bill is simple, and it is everybody in my seat today utilizes some sort of Connect the Dots program. Everybody's heard of Connect the Dots, right? Raise your hand if you have it. We'll out you. Good. 5 of you have. Excellent. Or 5 of you haven't. I can't remember what I asked. Okay. Connect the Dots is a mechanism by which when you apply for a job, you fill out certain documentation, and I'll just leave it very general. And you hand it to me. This includes your I-9 documentation, your application, those kinds of things. And then I ask you questions that are relatively narrowly tailored to prevent the OSC from getting too mad, but they ask enough to keep ICE happy. And they're about matching up the documents that you've given me. So if you graduated high school in New Mexico, but all of your documentation says you're from Puerto Rico. Okay, how do you ask that question, right? Well, everybody, at least the larger companies, utilize an online mechanism at this point to do that, where you go online and go through, fill in the I-9, and you provide your documentation, and then using the credit databases and all of that kind of stuff, comes back and says, okay, Chris Gaddis, when you were 1985, you lived at 1235 Eastridge Street in Boulder, Colorado, and you had a mortgage on that house. What was the amount of that mortgage? 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, 62,000? And then you answer those questions. We've all done this at our banks, but there's a mechanism to do that called self-check that the government actually created, right? Well, we aren't allowed to use self-check because the OSC hates it, but actually job applicants can use it to see if they'll pass E-Verify. Very confusing. But there are a lot of mechanisms that have been built to do that. Everybody uses those. Under the Senate bill, using something like that is per se discriminatory. Okay, so imagine that. Here's a tool that we're using, third-party tool that we're using to verify the work eligibility of an employee, and it's per se discriminatory. So again, until we're able to reconcile the tension between, again, worker eligibility on the one hand and non-discrimination on the other hand, I don't see it helping employers. Any questions? Wait, no questions. We'll ask questions later.
Question a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Avendaño. She is the director of the AFL-CIO Immigration Community Action. Am I saying that right? Community Action program, and she previously also was general counsel for the United Food and Commercial Worker Association. So I remember earlier today, I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it, but we were talking about the link between farm workers and food workers. She knows about that link. In addition, she holds a law degree from Georgetown University. She's been involved in labor issues for many, many years, and is an important link on this issue. Anna,
Thanks. So I'm here officially to talk to you a little bit about the low-wage labor market, low-wage workers, and temporary worker programs, and the impact, the solution that we've come up with in the Senate bill. I wasn't supposed to talk to you about enforcement, but I have some answers to your questions, so I'll talk to you later. We negotiated the worker protections in the Senate bill that you're just talking about, and it's a really interesting tension because you're right. Until 1986, there was no such thing as verification of the authorization to work in this country. 1986 imposed what we call employer sanctions for the first time, which essentially deputized employers to be agents of INS. And with that came a whole bunch of responsibilities and problems. There was problems that employers, there was a study done by GAO that found huge rates of discrimination. Employers were trying to avoid the whole system by not hiring workers who sound or look foreign. So anti-discrimination protections had to be built into the law, which is the OSC problem. So it's a really difficult balance, and I've worked with Mark on this a lot to try to find where does that balance lie. At the end of the day, you're right. Identity theft is a huge problem. How do you solve that? Short of asking everybody to provide their DNA and check it right away. It's a really difficult issue, and as long as we continue to regulate immigration in the workplace, it's a vexing issue. But I want to not talk about that. So I just want to talk a little bit about workers in the low-wage labor market. And what is the low-wage labor market? Meatpacking is a great example of an industry. Is it low-wage or not? There's nothing inherently about an industry that defines it as a low-wage industry. In the 1970s, meatpacking workers earned the highest average manufacturing wages in the country. At that time, meatpacking was highly unionized, 90% union density, subject to 4 master contracts. The industry changed radically in the late 70s, early 80s. It became deunionized. Plants moved to rural areas, and wages in the industry dropped significantly. And since then, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, where I used to work, has been reorganizing the industry, and this is with Mark. Your company is a good union company. But the industry itself, what was once paid the highest average manufacturing wages, is now in many parts of the country, a low-wage industry. So I'm going to give you some statistics, and I'm using the definition of low-wage industries as industries that the median wage for frontline workers is 85% of the city's median wage for the study that I'm going to share with you. Researchers at the University of California at Los Angeles, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the National Employment Law Project put together, I think, the most useful for us qualitative study of low-wage labor markets in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. Published a report called Broken Laws on Protected Workers in 2009. And low-wage industries were defined as everything from domestic workers to construction to car wash workers, really a broad scope of industries. And what the researchers found was that there were rampant labor violations in this labor market. Fully a quarter of workers in these three cities in the low-wage labor market were paid less than the minimum wage. Wage theft was pervasive. They estimated that about 15% of earnings were stolen from workers. And this is a direct quote from the study. Workers in low-wage industries in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York City lose more than $56.4 million per week as a result of employment and labor law violations. Foreign workers in this, and this market is not entirely foreign workers. It's 25% foreign workers. But foreign workers in this market are nearly twice as likely as US-born counterparts to suffer minimum wage violations. Now, why is this important for immigration purposes? It's important because, number one, the undocumented are highly concentrated in the low-wage labor market, and the conditions under which they labor fit everything that I've just described to you. And enforcement is a really, really, really important piece of the life of workers in the low-wage labor market, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. But it's also really important because as we're crafting the solution for what future flow, for what policy, under what policy, what terms, conditions, and what numbers and when, do workers come into the U.S. into that labor market? It seems a little crazy to just say, okay, we're going to let employers define how many workers they want to bring, when, and what industries, and just plop them right into this labor market that I just described. But that's essentially what we've had for some time. So and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what our approach to the Senate bill and crafting a new type of worker program. And it was a long road to get there. We struck a deal with the Chamber of Commerce on what a low-skilled, non-seasonal worker program looks like. So we have seasonal programs, H-2A for agricultural workers, H-2B for non-seasonal, non-skilled workers. For seasonal, non-skilled workers, I'm sorry. So packing and poultry don't count as seasonal. They would fit into our program. And so there's a whole bunch of occupational classifications that fit into the W visa program, including construction, not necessarily unskilled. Welders are very skilled workers who just happen to fall under one of the classifications that would be covered by the program. What we walked in there into the negotiation was with a commitment not to replicate the mistakes of the past. So we were not going to just recreate another temporary worker program like the H-2B program, whose structure is one that keeps workers essentially indentured and who relies on a long chain of labor recruiters from around the world that really enslave workers from the very beginning. And workers in many instances come into the U.S. with debt bondage. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I use these terms. I know that they're highly charged. But I would urge you to read a report by the Southern Poverty Law Center that was published in 2006 and just republished earlier this year called Close to Slavery about the H-2B program that defines conditions that are essentially creating an indentured worker program. Workers have to pay recruiters in Mexico or Guatemala, India, China, recruitment fees to be brought into the United States. When they arrive here, they're heavily indebted. Many times they've deeded their home to the recruiters back home, and they're brought here at the sponsorship of employers. The workers cannot leave that employment if they wish to remain legally present in the United States. And if they leave that employment, they still owe that recruiter an enormous debt. And we've seen fees of up to $20,000 that workers in the Gulf Coast post-Katrina paid. Famous case called Signal that was prosecuted under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that had paid to actually work here. So the fact that workers now had to have mobility and to regulate some of those recruitment abuses were key parts of what we sought to get out of the Senate bill. The other piece was what we heard so much about even in the high skill sector, is that workers are human beings. They have families. And temporary worker programs right now separate families because workers come to the U.S. to work and then they go home if they want to stay in the program legally. That means that it's men with an average of 2 children, young men, healthy, who are in these programs and separated from their families. Now, how do we know the characteristics of these workers? Because there is nothing regulating the employment of these workers when they're home in Mexico or Guatemala. U.S. laws don't apply. So recruiters go to Mexico and say, we would like to hire males with 2 children less than 35 years old because that's the profile that they've determined will guarantee that they'll go back home. So we had to regulate that somewhat. And also the issue of permanency is huge. I mean, there are societal implications of the fact that we are bringing more and more workers into this country without any democratic rights. And it is only fair that workers who want to stay here should have at least a chance to stay here. So those were the fundamental problems that we sought to address as we went into negotiations with the Chamber of Commerce, and business had their own needs for flexibility, et cetera, which I don't have time to tell you about now. But what we came up with is this new program called the W Visa, which essentially addresses that. It creates a new labor market for workers in the lower scale occupations owned at 1, 2, and some 3. Workers are going to be able to change jobs within those occupational classifications for any reason whatsoever. Workers will be able to self-petition for permanency, and they'll be able to bring their families with work authorization when they come into these jobs. So from the worker rights standpoint, that's a huge advancement in this area. It is not perfect. There's also the number that the program is capped at certain numbers that are actually connected to labor market conditions, labor shortages, which is another big area that I can talk to you much more about. But there's some rationality in this program. And so we're really pleased that this is a bipartisan negotiation. It's good public policy. And as we move a bill through the House, we are really committed to preserving this deal and the structure because it really is good public policy, not just for foreign workers, but for U.S. workers as well. Thank you.
So before I open up to the floor, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking all of you or some of you one question. Last night, Papa Demetrio brought up the issue of not picking a compromise number somewhere in the middle just for the sake of picking it and having market forces. And you all have mentioned having market forces determine how many temporary workers or new workers we need. So my question is, how do you do that? And how do you ensure that it's not just a company saying, I want this many workers, but also that it's not the government randomly setting, a time to change. So I guess it can just go across if that's,
Sure.
And then I'll open up.
So for our industry, and I'm sure for the AFL-CIO and UFCW and other these, my job is to reduce turnover and increase employee engagement, because it costs us about $12,000 to bring an employee up to speed on a meat packing line. Before they're profitable, it costs us about $12,000 to do that. So if we have rampant turnover in the first 6 months, it just kills us. It kills everyone in the industry. So in the case of temporary labor, while it's necessary, it will never be an integral part, at least, of our workforce at JBS. It'll be a stopgap when necessary. But we, like I said, we hire about 400 a month, and I don't imagine that would be more than 75 of the 400. So.
Anna, can you speak to the
Sure. So the determination, because we wanted to make sure that the numbers of this new program that I just described actually matched economic conditions. So the negotiations over what that means went on for months and months and months because there is no standard definition for a labor shortage, particularly in lower skilled occupations. And I'll leave it up to the economists to explain why, but I'll tell you the things we tried. Unemployment numbers don't work for a variety of reasons, and we're always told there's just not enough data at the granular level to actually determine what a labor market shortage is in these industries. The solution that is in the Senate bill is the creation of a new commission that's loosely modeled after the MAC commission in Britain, which actually deals with a little bit of a different labor force, but actually sets flows based on the formula that's determined by the MAC economists every year or every 2 years, and that raises and lowers caps depending on how the labor shortages in particular industries. We have a compromise of that in the Senate bill. The commission doesn't actually set the caps. What the commission concludes is part of a larger formula that also includes employer desires for numbers, which didn't make any sense, but that's a compromise. And so the program that we crafted has increasing caps, and then within those increasing caps, there is some flexibility depending on labor market conditions.
So I talked about labor shortages this morning, but I do agree that putting it into practice to come up with an exact number, A, is very hard to do, and B, I'm not sure that's the right way. I don't mind the caps. I mean, both for the reasons of political compromise and because, as I just said, the labor market is so lousy right now. I don't mind this kind of artificial mechanism trying to determine numbers. I don't think that's the ideal way to do this over the long term and when the labor market is healthier. So one can imagine a different mechanism. Instead of trying to figure out quantities of shortage, which I think is always going to be very controversial, there are more market ways of setting this up that don't even require shortages necessarily. So one can imagine the H-1B program or some others having a real market, having a real auction, where instead of artificially putting caps and setting prices based on nothing except politics, you let people bid based on the value that the immigrants provide in that sector. Both the numbers and the prices would go way up, because if employers really see this great value in it, they would then bid higher, be willing to spend more. You could say then that money should be spent on training domestic workers in those industries, which I think those are compromises. But I think in practice that would be, I'm just trying to say alternative to trying to do this thing of, oh, let's count up the shortages and create a cap number that fits that. There's a whole other set of mechanisms that are really much more market-based that I would at least put on the table to discuss as well. Not necessarily advocate for, but at least think about them too.
And Giovanni's written a whole paper on the auction, I believe, so we can get back to that.
Yeah, so I think the way I think about it is there's sort of two ends of the spectrum. One where we are right now, which is employers don't have to show a need or a shortage or a market test at all for either the H-1B or the L-1. And then the other is you should show some kind of need, right? This is a guest worker program. It's a government intervention into the normal functioning of the labor market and the education market. You would think that economists would support markets. For whatever reason, many of them don't in this case. So I think you want to have some mechanism of showing need. Now, on one end of that spectrum of showing need, you could have a very bureaucratic process of trying to review applications at the individual level. You could try to do it in a broader occupational level. You know, the Migration Advisory Commission uses both a top-down and a bottoms-up, where they not only look at the larger sort of unemployment rates and things like that, but also go out and collect field data and find out what employers say, what workers in those occupations say in terms of the labor market and the like. You could do something like that. Or you could have really a non-regulatory process where you really set a fairly high wage. If you set a high wage, you know, the people where there's a real need, you know, and these are super specialized skilled folks or even above average skilled folks, they should be paid those higher wages. So if you raise those wage floors significantly, I think you would see a way of getting around a sort of a bureaucratic, sort of strong regulatory process. Problem is, of course, the employers don't want that wage to go up too high.
Before I open,
Say one more thing about that. Just to pick up on that, immigration is one policy solution to a labor market shortage, but is by no means the only one. Currently, that's the whole frame for our temporary worker programs. The MAC Commission in Britain has actually ordered other policy solutions when identified shortages, particularly in the low-wage labor market, which included labor market interventions that raised minimum wage and set other social policy. So I think that's really important to note because our immigration system just does not recognize that one important aspect. Training could be another policy solution to a labor shortage.
I'm going to open it up really quickly. I just want to explain that Harjo Saluja was going to be our fourth or fifth panelist, and he's actually stuck in Asia where he's opening one of his new office. Because he's had so much trouble, he said, getting H-1B visas here. He has a small startup, and what is interesting, just to throw out, is that he said that he had a lot of trouble hiring U.S. workers because he can't compete with places like Microsoft that can provide these packages and are pretty stable long term. You know, he's a startup, it could go under, and U.S. workers are less interested in taking risks in the marketplace right now than for what he needs. So on that note, questions from the audience? Please introduce yourself, please.
Jonathan Clark from the Nogales, Arizona International Newspaper. I have a question for Chris. I'm also a vegetarian. Is there anything about that you could do in your industry to make it less horrific, that would make it more attractive to American workers? Because you hear that explanation as well, that there are jobs that are so brutal that American workers don't want to do them, no matter if the wage is good or not. But is there something that and when I read that Wall Street Journal piece, it struck me that, boy, this industry is still really, the process is very
manual.
Yeah, so is there something that employers in these sectors could do perhaps to make the jobs less unappealing?
I want to just ask you guys to really keep the questions tight because we're already way over time. So.
First of all, horrific is not a technical term. No, listen, they're hard jobs. They're hard jobs, and they're jobs that, due to the, speaking specific to beef, and we have a beef plant in Arizona, speaking specific to beef, the size of the animals varies enough that it's not as automated, perhaps, as the chicken industry or the pork industry, where the animals are smaller, and they all sort of fit the same size parameters, so it can be more mechanized. So it's very manual, it's very hard work, but I think it's also very well-paid work. Base wages in our plants for a starting hourly production worker would be about $14.50 an hour, somewhere in there, $14 to $14.50 an hour, with full benefits within 90 days. Well, under Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, excuse me, everybody will have to be under 90 days. We are currently seeing our turnover come down pretty dramatically. And to us, that's the best indicator that we have, that people are engaged in their jobs and, believe it or not, liking their jobs. We have a lot of 2 and 3 generation families in our plants. Mom and dad work there, and son works there, and now grandson works there, and all 3 generations are working there together. So we have a lot of people that take a lot of pride in the work. But frankly, I agree with you. It's hard work. It's incredibly hard work, and that makes us value our employees that much more.
Okay, I'm going to ask both the questioners and the respondents, please, just because we want to get as many people in as possible.
Sure, I'm Anna Pfeiffer from the Financial Times and a current Neiman Fellow. I have a question for Anna. You just mentioned the House bill. How are you feeling about the prospects for that side of things now?
Nobody knows. President gave a press conference yesterday, re-energized the debate, got out in front of the Republicans. Darrell Issa is talking about dropping a bill. HR 15, which is a version of the Senate bill, is on the floor. It has 184 co-sponsors. If I were a betting person, I would bet that at least 1, 2, or 3 Republicans will soon sign on. And it really is all about whether the leadership is going to allow this bill to go to the floor. I don't know how anything can happen through regular order. I just don't see that.
Please. Oh, okay. I just want to make sure, has anyone not spoken up who wants to answer a question who hasn't spoken all day before I call on repeats? You spoken?
I have a question for Chris. So after those raids, how did you go about finding enough workers? You said you relied on refugees, but I'm sure not all your workforce is refugees.
So the raids impacted 4 plants, and by our estimates, cost $55 million. It's a pretty expensive decision. And we barnstormed the country. And we went to your neck of the woods. We went to Laredo. We went anywhere that we could to find people with a propensity to work in packing plants, and literally went everywhere.
So what percentage of your workforce is either immigrant or refugee?
Immigrants a tough one because we track first generation, second generation, third generation as best as we can. You account for refugees and up to third generation immigrants, about 50%. First generation immigrants and refugees, again, these numbers stink because we aren't allowed to keep great data on it, probably 15 to 20% of our workforce.
Why do you keep third generation? Just out of curious.
For the reasons I brought up earlier, to see, we have, in some cases, 3 generations of people that have worked for us. So that's how we track it.
And my name's Andrew. I'm a reporter with the Fox television station in Phoenix. My question's for Ron. When I look at your presentation and I see all those numbers, at first I was kind of surprised, and I'm thinking, my gosh, we need more US-born people for these jobs. It's unbelievable. But when I think about it some more, if they hired more US-born people who demanded a higher wage, would it have a negative effect on the economy if that was the case? Because wouldn't there be fewer jobs, the employers don't want to hire as many people, and in turn mean less productivity?
Sure. This is an interesting question, and I think the term competitiveness and economic competitiveness has been hijacked. It's actually become a code word for we should all take lower wages. So you and I, everybody in this room, if we took a 20% pay cut, we would make America more competitive, right? Because we would increase productivity, right? Think about it. Right, so what's the end? Is it productivity? Is it to raise your standard of living? If wages don't go up, then your standard of living doesn't go up, right? So
as an employee, I would love to make more money. But as an employer, I look at it like, well, if I could...
Sure, and profits, so the NASDAQ is now close to 4,000. It's closing in to where it was in the bubble days. March of 2000, it was up to 5,000. Right now, it's up close to 4,000. So the companies are doing great. You know, IBM has been offshoring like crazy. Their profitability is great. They have so much, they're so flush with money that they have actually done $100 billion worth of share buybacks in the last 10 years. That outstrips how much they spent on R&D. They spent about $60 billion over that 10-year period. So companies are making a lot of money. The problem isn't profitability, right? If you look at it within the tech sector or across the board, the problem is wages aren't going up, right?
Could I respond to that also? Because there's another point of view. There's many, many responses that one could make to Ron's, and it would take some time to go there. Ron's arguments that this kind of hiring, and again, there's a lot of things we could do to make H-1B better, many reforms in the Senate bill and other things, and uses of that money. You can take Ron's argument that any going abroad does nothing except depress native-born wages and raise profits. You can argue against any kind of international trade, any kind of imports, any kind of offshoring. And that's the point of view that I think most economists reject. The notion that if you can bring in, I mean, there's economic analysis, number one, that says that in fact H-1B visas are good for local labor markets, that they make innovation less expensive, there's positive spillovers onto the labor market, and you can debate those studies. But again, this notion that all it does is screw workers and raise profits, I think throws out almost all the economics we know about international trade and the benefits of international flows. And I just want to put that on the table too. And it would probably take a lot longer for Ron and I to solve our disagreements about this, but that notion that it's bad only if it lowers costs and lowers wages, I think is very narrow frame for thinking about this whole set of issues.
So let me respond a little bit. I'm certainly not arguing for autarky. I am concerned about offshoring, but certainly I'm not arguing for autarky, where we should close off ourselves. And in fact, I support increased levels of permanent immigration at the high skill level. I think we can absorb those increased levels. I'm skeptical on guest worker visas, which are interventions. Again, economists always love to talk about market failures and that we should only intervene, the government should only intervene, when there's a significant market failure and they can make things better. I don't see how you're intervening in a market, bringing in lower cost workers where you have the ability and the supply already, or you could create the supply fairly easily. And we could talk about those individual labor markets and how difficult that is. If you talk to people in the IT services sector, there's a burgeoning domestic services market where they do a lot of workforce development and they're able to compete.
And we support all these things, but all of us, I think, agree, if you took those temporary guest worker programs and changed them in ways that it's easier for the workers to shift jobs, it's easier for them to stay, to apply for permanent residency, all of those would be pro-market forces that I think all of us would agree on. Right?
Right.
So we're not necessarily locked into this vision of temporary only. I would say the analytical frame should be broader for how we think about the pluses and minuses.
But the Senate bill also has a merit point system, which I think makes some sense, right? I mean, if you really need those skills, the employers have always opposed that, right? A merit point system where somebody gets a green card and then they're able to work wherever they want.
Okay. Maybe 1 and 2 more questions.
This is for Ron and you as well. Microsoft has an interesting proposal, which is to tie H-1B visas or green card visas to STEM research. And they started an organization called Inspire STEM. The Senate bill totally ignored it, but different House bills do it. So you make tech companies, you make IT services companies pay more for H-1Bs, and that money goes into the other part of the labor problem, which is teaching people K through graduate school. I just want to know what you think about that. I thought it was a clever positioning idea. I'm not sure if it's a good policy idea.
I like the general concept, and it's not the first time. I mean, I will say that the Obama administration is going to announce a set of workforce development initiatives in November. And they are at least thinking about what they could do with H-1B money to support that broader range of domestic workforce development. The Clinton administration did it too. Took the money in that elevated period and spent it on training for the domestic. I think that's a fine idea. There's a lot of different ways you could do it, and I don't know the particulars of that one. Why not? Why not take the money and really try to train the domestic workforce as much as you can? And that was my idea of an auction. It would probably generate a lot more money of that type, which we could then invest. If those are public dollars, we could then invest in things that probably all of us would be in favor of to generate more domestic supply.
So there has been an existing H-1B skills training grant program. The GAO did a study of it not that long ago, maybe a few years back, and they found that it was actually going more towards technician level work and not towards IT type of training. The whole Microsoft proposal and whatnot has a whole backstory, and I point you to an article in Mother Jones magazine that talks about how they were able to get the STEM Ed Coalition to support the bill, in part because the STEM Ed Coalition was expecting to get some money, but by the time the bill actually went through, it was kind of a bait and switch. They lowered the amount of money that was going to be paid, the fees that would be paid. And you're talking about not that much money in the scheme of things.
Tara, do you want to?
Sure. Tara Magner, MacArthur Foundation. This is an operational question that probably should be posed to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, but perhaps one of you know the answer. In a year where many applications come in for H-1B on the day the new visas become available, so far exceeding the 65,000 plus whatever add-ons. How does the agency process those? How do they, so if, let's say, Unisys has 20,000 applications and IBM has 20,000, is that a sort of a random draw from a pool, or how do they sequence the processing of the ones that come in all at the same time?
So the window opens for petitions on April 1st for the fiscal year starting October 1st, so 6 months before, which tells you something also about how they're doing their hiring practices, right? Those workers can't start working until October, so they're leaving those positions open for that 6 months. So what they've done is generally it's a first come, first serve, and if they expect that the number of applications will exceed the cap, what they do is a random lottery. And so they do that within the first day. You have to have it postmarked and all of that stuff by that first day, and then they run a random lottery. But what you see is that, again, it's a first come, first serve, and companies that are anticipating that the cap's going to be hit are going to send in a lot more petitions than they really need. And that's why you see Cognizant really up their H-1B petitions up to 9,000. They got FY12. They got 9,000 H-1Bs in 1 year. Just give you a frame of reference, Facebook's entire employment is 4,500. So they have twice the number of Facebook employees just in 1 year on H-1B. So.
Thank you so much, everybody. Let's take a break for lunch.